Dedicated to Marie and Joan Goines, because both of my sisters believed in my writing ability when I had just about given up hope of ever being published. Donald Goines. For 23 years of his young life, Donald Goines lived in the dark, despair-ridden world of the junkie. It started while he was doing military service in Korea and ended up with his murder at the age of 37. He had worked up to $100 a day habit, and out of the agonizing hell came Dopefiend. It is the shocking nightmare story of a black heroin addict trapped in the festering sore of a major American ghetto. A young man and his girlfriend, both handsome, talented, and full of promise, are inexorably pulled into the living death of the hardcore junkie. Hello, and welcome to Ralph Reads, brought to you by TURN, the United Ronin Networks. My name is Ralph Anthony Garcia, also known as R4. Please like, share, comment, and subscribe to the United Ronin Networks. We are Ronin. On this edition of Ralph Reads, I conclude the miniseries Donald Goines, Dopefiend. Folks, let's get right into it, shall we? Let the reading commence. Chapter 18. While Porky dressed slowly, preparing to keep a monthly appointment with the vice detectives to pay them their blood money in order to keep on dealing poison, Teddy ran through alleys from the cab driver he had just stuck up. The knife he had used was still clutched in his hand as he ran out from between two houses and made for Snake's car. He climbed behind the steering wheel, cursing loudly. $6 funky-ass dollars? He thought angrily. I risked my life for $6 funky-ass dollars? He started the car up. One of them would have to go for gas, he reasoned, staring down at the gas gauge. When he reached Porky's, he had to stand in line with two other addicts who were trying to get credit. There, a short, dark Negro with a long scar across his face cursed. I spend close to $100 a day with you bastards, Ed, he yelled angrily. I ain't but $3 short, man. I know you can stand that. Big Ed shook his head. Porky's in the bedroom, Bear. I just went and asked him about it, man, and he said he ain't giving no credit up today. Lenny, Bear's hustling partner, spoke up. We didn't have no car this morning, Ed. That's why we were short. Now, Teddy here got some transportation, so we'll have some cash in about an hour. All we want is some stuff to hold us until we come back from hustling. Again, Big Ed shook his head. Ain't nothing I can do about it. I ain't going into my own pocket to help you junkies out. Bear glanced upon the room angrily. He stared at Gigi, who was cradling a shotgun across his knees. Nigga, don't point that gun in my direction, he stated, his eyes flashing fire. You punks get these funky-ass jobs of being doormen and let it go to your goddamn heads, he yelled in Big Ed's face. That's enough of that shit, Porky yelled as he came out of the bedroom. You ain't turning my place into no goddamn arena, Bear. The man told you ain't no dope unless you got the money, so make the best of that. Lenny stepped up. He was tall, thin, with long hair that at one time had been a process. He pulled on Bear's arm. He knew there was no win for them there. Also, he didn't want to be denied entry into Porky's house. It was not fear that made them back up, only a desire not to be refused entry into the best dope house in the city. We don't want no trouble, Porky. It's just that we was on our way to hustle, and we ain't had our morning dew yet. He hesitated, then added, we thought, 'cause we spend so much money with you, we could get a small favor this morning, between us. We spend at least $100 a day with you. The only favor I can do for you is to sell you a $10 pack today, Porky replied coldly. Every dope fiend that comes through my door spends money with me, but I sure give him what he wants to buy. I'd say if you ain't got enough money, you best pull what you got together and let that hold you. I ain't got but $5, Teddy said quickly. He wiped his nose on the back of his hand. Bear went into his own pocket, still grumbling. He pulled out a $5 bill and gave it to his partner. All three of the men stared angrily at Porky. It was just a matter of allowing them some time. Porky knew that they could be out in the streets stealing. If they didn't go to jail, he'd get his money, because something would be stolen and sold. Smokey came out of a nod, and her arm brushed a glass of water off the armrest of the couch. The glass hit and cracked, setting bloody water and glass all over the filthy floor. Her eyes searched the room. Irene, she called as she noticed a young, chubby girl sitting at the kitchen table nodding. Bring a broom out of the kitchen, honey, and clean some of this mess up. Irene glanced up from her nod, saw who was speaking, and got up to get the broom. As she passed, Teddy grabbed her arm. Hey, baby, let me get $3 or $4 from you until we get back, he asked. She jerked her arm loose, then snarled over her shoulder. Why don't you ask that white bitch you supposed to have for some money? Fuck that bitch, Lenny said as he turned toward Porky. We got $16 altogether. I'll take the responsibility for the other $4, and I'll bring it back as soon as we score. Smokey, Porky yelled. Make up 3 $5 packs for these people. He turned and grinned at her. That way, they won't be in my debt. Bear cursed. Teddy groaned, realizing a $5 pack might not be enough to get their sickness off. Lenny was too old and experienced to let his feelings show. But in his heart, there was a burning rage. He hated Porky with a passion. The years had been bitter for him. He could remember when people like Porky used to bend over backwards to be his friend. Yes, before he started using, it had been a different story. Promising young pimp with a stable of 4 whores and a Cadillac. Smokey made her way into the bedroom without comment. She wondered idly what kind of fun Porky got out of playing with his customers. She knew they were worth the $4 because all 3 of them were thieves. As she started to go past the bed, one of the dogs tried to stick his nose under her housecoat. She ignored him and continued on to the closet. The dog followed, smelling at her feverishly. She opened the closet door and spun around on the dog. He stopped suddenly, but he was too late. Her hand came out of the closet with a short, black whip. The dog tried to escape, but she brought the whip down on his face before he could turn away. You black son of a bitch, she cursed. I may have trained you, but I'll break you too, you bastard! She swung the whip again, catching him across the back. The other dog froze to the floor, not moving, trying to appear a groveling lapdog. Smokey tossed the whip on the bed and got some dope out of one of the coat pockets. She walked over to the bed and began to make up the packages. When she glanced up at the dogs, both of them were staring at her. She reached for the whip, and both of them started to cringe. "Just as long as you bastards know your place," she mumbled. But as she said it, she realized that the dogs were becoming a problem. They were both too big to be so freakish. She made up her mind that in the near future, she'd have to poison one of them. The other could go a little later. If Porky just had to have a freakish dog, she'd get him a small poodle and train it. Smokey brought out the tiny bags and held them out to the men. They accepted them because there was nothing else they could do. Porky went back into the bedroom and continued dressing. A little later, Big Ed came into the bedroom. "Dave's got the car out front, Porky," he said. "Here, Daddy," Smokey said, holding out his cashmere overcoat. Porky slipped on the expensive coat and stood in the middle of the room, undecided. "I hate to leave them niggas here, Ed," he said, thinking out loud. "Bear might try and get mean when he finds out ain't nobody here but Gigi and Smokey." He glanced at his watch. "We still got 15 minutes. We'll wait until they leave or put them out before we go." When he went into the living room, Lenny was having trouble hitting in the neck, but Bear finally caught the vein for him. After shooting the dope, they got up to leave. Porky and Big Ed followed them out of the apartment and down the steps. The men didn't bother to speak to each other as each group went its way out on the street. Bear and Lenny piled into Teddy's car. He started the motor and watched Porky and Big Ed climb into the Cadillac. "I wonder where he's going," Teddy asked quietly. "You think he's going to cop now?" The question went unanswered as the men wondered to themselves if that was what Porky was on his way to do. "Why don't you follow him for a few minutes?" Bear asked on the spur of the moment. The big caddy leapt away from the curb. The men in it were not aware of the smaller car that pulled out more slowly in their wake. They hadn't gone more than 4 blocks when Porky ordered his driver, Dave, to pull up to the curb and park. "I won't be but a few minutes," he said as he lifted his huge weight out of the car. Big Ed and Dave remained quiet as he got out. They knew he was going to make the payoff. He did it every month. The only thing that varied was the place where they dropped him off. He never went to the same spot twice. They watched Porky as he waddled down the street, too occupied to notice the car with Teddy driving go slowly past. When they saw Porky get out of the car by himself, Bear shouted with joy. "He's going to cop," he yelled. "Man, he's really on his way to cop." He turned to Lenny. "Let's take the fat son of a bitch off now." This was something Teddy hadn't figured on. Robbing Porky had never entered his mind, really. He sat shaking with fear, hoping that Lenny would refuse. "What you think, Teddy?" Lenny asked. "Should we wait until after the fat bastard cops, or should we rip him off now while he's got the cash on him?" The question was a two-bladed one. Either way was trouble. "I don't know," Teddy answered truthfully. "Well, I know," Bear answered quickly. "Catch up with him," he ordered in a voice that would tolerate no refusal. Teddy turned the corner behind Porky. Bear watched Big Ed and Dave closely as they turned. "I don't think they even see us. All they were watching was Porky's fat ass," he said. "Park behind that car up there," he ordered, pointing out a car in front of Porky. "Duck, Lenny!" he yelled as he went past the fat man. Teddy pulled into the curb, moving at the commands of the other man, unable to make his own decisions. Porky noticed Teddy at the steering wheel as the car went past. It only annoyed him that Teddy had seen him walking. His mind didn't give off any warning. He continued on his way, hoping to get far enough away so that Teddy wouldn't see whose car he got into. As he started past the car, the door opened, and Bear jumped out. In that instant, Porky realized his mistake. His heart leapt, and fear choked his mouth and throat. It was the same fear that used to fill his soul when he was a child and the neighborhood kids ganged up on him. The terrible fear of not being able to move, of being rooted in cold terror. Bear Bear snatched him around and pushed him over onto the car. The knife he held was inches away from Porky's face. "What's the matter with you guys? What you want from me?" Porky managed to ask. Lenny was already fumbling with his pants pocket. "Where's the rest of your money, Porky?" he asked as he pulled a large bankroll from Porky's pocket. "We ain't got time for no games, Porky." Porky could feel his legs giving out from under him. He wondered if he could stand without their aid. In his heart, he knew he was a coward. His huge size meant nothing. Any amount of exertion was enough to cause him pain and loss of breath. Even now, he could feel his breathing become shallow. It was pure terror that leapt from his eyes. He glanced up and down the street, praying to catch sight of the detectives. Bear swung his fist into Porky's stomach. A hard, short blow. Porky grunted as though someone had let out all his wind. "The rest of the money, Porky," Bear growled angrily. "We want that money you was going to use to cop with." Hastily, Porky fumbled under his coat and drew out the envelope containing the detective's $1,000. He shoved the money at them. "That's it," he cried. "Take it, but please, just leave me alone." Lenny grabbed the envelope and glanced in it. He could see the $100 bills. "This is it," he yelled excitedly. "We got it!" Lenny jumped back into the car. "Come on, Bear, we got it!" Bear didn't bother to answer. His fists began to move viciously. His punches rained down on Porky until the fat man fell down on his knees. Then Bear kicked him viciously against the head. As Porky fell at his feet, Bear took his knife and bent down and stabbed him twice in the fat of his shoulder. As he watched, Teddy saw the knife plunge down. "Don't kill him!" he screamed in panic. Quickly, he started the motor of the car. "Oh my God!" Porky screamed, then started to shriek at the top of his voice. He sounded like a woman as his voice became shrill. Not wanting to be left behind, Bear leapt inside the car just as Teddy started to pull away from the curb. Before the car had disappeared around the corner, Porky staggered to his feet. A black, unmarked police car pulled up in front of him. The two detectives sitting inside the car stared at Porky for a moment. Then one of them jumped out. He grabbed Porky around the waist and tried to hold him up. "Looks like somebody done worked old Porky over!" he yelled back to his partner. Porky stared at the police officers. His voice wouldn't come back to him for a minute. It wasn't the pain, really. It was the shock. He was scared almost out of his mind. He glanced up and down the street, afraid the men would come back. "I'm going to need some help," the detective called as he staggered under the load of Porky. The other officer got out of the car. "Has he still got our money on him?" he asked as he came around the police car. "I don't know," the first white officer replied as he expertly ran his hands through Porky's pockets. Porky shook his head. He managed to find his voice. "They took all my money, every penny of it!" He felt the blood running down his back and almost fainted. "I'm bleeding to death!" he screamed in the officer's face. Between them, they managed to get Porky in the car and rush him to the nearest hospital. One of them called Smokey and informed her of what had happened. Smokey locked up the shooting gallery and rushed toward the hospital, carrying a fresh $1,000 for the detectives. They met her in the lobby. After she paid them, they left the building, already assured by the doctors that Porky would be all right. Smokey waited for 2 hours until Porky was ready to leave, his left arm in a sling. They caught a cab in silence, both of them deep in thought. Porky directed the cab around to where he had left his Cadillac. Dave and Big Ed were still sitting where he had left them. Their faces showed their surprise as they watched Porky climb out of the cab with his arm in a sling. The sight of Smokey beside him was an extra jolt. They both wondered who was at the house taking care of the dope traffic. It was almost unheard of, both Smokey and Porky being out of the house at the same time. As they rode back toward the shooting gallery, Porky explained what had happened. When he got out of the car in front of his flat, he pulled Big Ed aside. "There's $3,000 on every one of them motherfuckers' heads, Ed. I want you to take care of this personally. When you get them, bring them here." He held out the key to the downstairs flat. "This will get you in the back door." He removed another key from his keyring. "This is the one to the car. You take Gigi with you." They walked toward the house. When they got inside, Smokey was already on the phone in the bedroom. Gigi followed Big Ed into the bedroom and sat on the floor. They listened as she called one dope dealer after another. Each one she promised the same thing, a piece of pure dope if the dealer could help them put their hands on either Teddy, Bear, or Lenny. "How long you think it will take?" Gigi asked as Porky gave him a small amount of dope to use. Porky shrugged. "I don't care if it takes a lifetime, just as long as one day I see them punks downstairs tied up." After hanging up the phone, Smokey stretched out on the bed so that Big Ed could hit her in the neck. Before he was finished, the phone rang. Porky answered the phone, and a smile broke across his face when he hung up. He walked to the dresser and removed the package. "Bear and Lenny are over to Count's house on the west side." He tossed the package of dope on the bed. "You know where Count's dope house is at?" he asked. Big Ed shook his head. "I do," Gigi stated, picking the dope up off the bed. "What do we do when we get them?" he asked coldly. "Don't let that worry you, Gigi," Porky replied. "Ed knows what to do." Ed grinned. He ran the dope into Smokey's neck. The sight of the abscess on her neck disturbed him for a moment. "You better do something about this abscess, Smokey. It's getting pus in it." He removed the long needle from her neck vein. "What about the money they might have on him?" he asked, well aware of Porky's disregard for money. "It's yours too," Porky answered. "Just make sure they're alive and kicking when I come downstairs. You can tell Gigi about the $6,000 you're going to have to split between you if you take care of this right." He watched the greed jump up in the men's eyes. "What about Teddy?" Smokey asked as they watched Big Ed and Gigi depart, both men wearing shoulder holsters with 38 police specials riding gently under their arms. "Teddy? Teddy won't be no problem." Porky laughed for the first time that day. "Teddy won't be no problem at all." Chapter 19. The evening shadows were beginning to invade her room as she rolled over and sat up. For a minute, her thoughts were disturbed by a small, nagging voice reprimanding her for her ill treatment of her only friend. She walked over to the dresser and looked at the small amount of dope lying there. She took the back of a matchbook cover and split the dope into 2 piles. She raked the larger one into her cooker and put water on top of it. She held 2 matches under it until the white powder dissolved, then drew it up with her dropper. She had a little trouble finding a vein, but at least she hit. She shot the dope in quickly and jacked the works off a few times before pulling out of her vein. As she dressed, she caught herself glancing at the other pile of heroin, but she fought the desire before she could give in to it. She folded the dope inside some tinfoil and left the room. Terry knocked on Minnie's door, lightly at first, then harder. When there was still no answer, she tried the doorknob. It opened slowly under her pressure. She stepped into the room. At first, the only thing she noticed was the dresser. Then her eyes traveled upwards, and a slowly swinging apparition came into view. She opened her mouth in horror. The sight in front of her froze her in her tracks. She stared in terror at the body gently swinging back and forth. The sight of Minnie hanging there was shocking enough, but when her eyes turned downward, away from the sight of her friend's contorted face, they fell on what looked to be a child's head protruding from between Minnie's naked legs. The head of the baby was covered with afterbirth, while only part of its body showed. The rest was still hung up somewhere inside the dead woman's body. Terry's first scream shattered the stillness of the small hotel. Her second and third followed in a sequence of sound uninterrupted by the arrival of some of the hotel residents. One of the men reached for her in an attempt to quiet her down. She jerked away from him, then her foot slipped and she fell on the floor, her hand sliding through the waste that had escaped from Minnie's body. She raised her hands and stared at the excrement on them. The feces only increased her horror. She screamed again and again. The men managed to get her out of the room and into the hallway. Once outside, two women tried to help her. She held her hands behind her back, afraid to look at them. When one of the women wiped the feces from her hands, she began to scream again. The police arrived and called an ambulance. They had to strap Terry to a stretcher before they could get her out of the building. One of them held her down, while another gave her a shot. Her screams still rang from the walls as they took her from the hotel. People stood around in small clusters and discussed the suicide. It had helped to remove the dullness from their lives. It was something to talk about the rest of the winter. When they mentioned Terry, they shook their heads, not really knowing what could be the outcome in her case. The only thing they could agree on was the fact that none of them had ever heard a woman scream like that before. Porky sat at his window looking out. His house was empty for one of the few times of its existence. Since Ed and Gigi left, he had kept the doors closed, refusing to allow even his best customers in. Smokey sat on the couch nodding. Earlier in the evening, he had watched as they carried Minnie's body out of the hotel. His eyes had widened in surprise as Terry came out of the hotel strapped to a cot. Smokey had roused herself enough to go across the street and find out what happened. Now, with only the streetlights revealing the shabbiness of the neighborhood, Porky waited and watched. This was his street, he thought. Everything that happened on this block had a way of coming back to him. Now, as he watched, a car pulled up with a young white man driving. He wondered curiously who the woman could be turning the trick with the whitey. He grinned when the woman jumped out of the car. It was Donna Jean, a sissy who worked in drag. The women's clothes she wore were always the most expensive she could find. She stood waiting for the trick to come around the car, her hands on her broad hips, standing invitingly with her legs wide. She had a long face that was quite feminine except for the huge nose. The couple walked up the pathway leading to the hotel, arm in arm. Porky smiled knowingly. He had wished many times in the past that Donna Jean would become an addict, but the queer was too wrapped up in buying women's clothes to waste money on dope. He would have liked to see if his dog would be interested in Donna Jean. That would be a sight, he imagined. A sissy and one of his dogs, or both, indulging in an orgy. Without warning, his vivid mental pictures were interrupted by the hotel door flying open. The white trick came running out of the hotel with his coat on his arm. He stopped at the back of his car and managed to get his key in the lock of the trunk. Donna Jean came running out of the hotel, coatless. She made a straight beeline toward the trick. The trick got the trunk open and turned around to meet Donna's charge with a tire iron. The sissy let out a loud scream, twisted around in midair, and ran toward the alley with the trick in hot pursuit. Porky opened the window, ignoring the blast of cold air that entered so he could see better. He followed the running pair until they were out of sight. "Close the damn window, Porky," Smokey said irritably. "It ain't summer out there yet." Before he could comply, the couple came running back around the house they had run behind. The sissy was brandishing a large 2x4 and screaming at the top of his voice. His skirt was pulled up above his hips, displaying the jockstrap he wore. The trick managed to make it to his car, but the sissy was so close he couldn't stop to get in. Around and around the car they went. Porky started to laugh so hard that huge tears ran down his cheeks. Smokey got up from the couch and came over to the window. Someone ought to kill that goddamn sissy, she muttered. All they do is draw heat. As if to prove her correct, a police car came roaring up the streets. The sissy saw the police car before the trick did. He stopped chasing the John and ran back into the hotel. When the car stopped, one of the policemen jumped out and ran after him. Porky closed the window. "He'll never catch that punk," he said loudly. "Them goddamn sissies can run faster than the average man." Smokey had already lost interest and returned to her couch. "How about giving me another blow, Daddy?" she asked softly. "All this waiting got me on edge. I need a taste to smooth my nerves." He snorted. "If I listen to you, bitch, every time you go take a piss, you get on edge. In fact, every time you fart, you need a blow to smooth down your nerves." Regardless of his words, Porky walked into the bedroom and returned, tossing her a half-a-quarter package of dope to shoot. "Don't ask me to hit you, Smokey," leaving no doubt in her mind that he meant what he said. Some dope fiends parked in front of the house. Porky opened the door and yelled down the stairs as they entered. "Ain't nothing happening! Try tomorrow! I'll be together by then!" He shut the door and barred it, not bothering to wait for their reply. He watched from the window as they climbed back in the car. Another hour went by. Smokey finally got a hit in her neck. She held the mirror up and hit in it. Only an experienced drug addict can go in the jugular vein without the help of another addict. There was a sharp knock on the door. "It's me, Ed," came the reply when Porky asked who it was. He opened the door slightly, leaving it on the chain while he peeped out. The hallway was too dark for him to see through the peepholes he had in the door. Porky opened the door quickly. "Did you take care of that?" he asked sharply, his voice quivering with eagerness. "Downstairs," Ed answered slowly. The thought of the money he would make out of this was burning his brain. He had never had so much money before in his life. "Daving here, is he asked as they went down the stairs. "Sent him to the movies," Porky answered flatly. "The less people know about this, the better off he is." They had to go outside and around to the back door to get into the flat downstairs. Porky could see the outlines of his car sitting in the garage. "Didn't nobody see you putting them in the car, did they?" he asked cautiously. Big Ed shook his head, a motion Porky couldn't see in the dark. "Nope. We parked on a side street, and it was empty when we come out. This cold weather keeps most people inside anyway." They entered the house through the back door, which led directly to the kitchen. Porky locked the door behind them, then followed Ed into the dining room. The house was void of any furnishings. Bear and Lenny were sitting against the wall, with their hands tied tightly behind their backs. Well, Porky said, and kicked Bear in the stomach. "It's a shame I can't mark you two up. I'd sure love being able to work ya over." He flashed a cold, deadly smile. "Get some water, Gigi. Ain't no sense taking longer than we have to." He removed a package of dope from his pocket. "You boys is real lucky. I'm gonna give you a dope fiend's dream." Bear's eyes glittered with unconcealed hatred. He stared at the sling on Porky's arm. "I should have killed you," he stated with arrogance. "If it hadn't been from them tremblers I was with, I'd fixed your fat ass good." "God damn you!" Porky cursed. He could feel his knees beginning to shake with the same fear he had felt earlier. "Get him ready," he ordered, not wanting anyone to see the fear he felt. Big Ed snatched Bear away from the wall. When he tried to struggle, Ed hit him viciously against the head. He pinned the struggling man to the floor with his knee, then rolled up his sleeve. Porky slowly cooked the pure heroin. "You don't even need to cook that stuff, Porky," Gigi said over his shoulder as he watched the heroin start to dissolve once the water hit it. "Damn, I wonder what it feels like to shoot some stuff that good." Lenny started to beg. "Please, y'all can't do this to us. We done gave back the money, all except what Teddy got." He tried another approach. "Porky," he cried, "I'll tell you where Teddy's at, man. I'll show you what motel he checked in. I'll even take you there and help you get him, Porky. Porky, you hear, man?" Porky stared into Bear's face as he stuck the needle into his arm. Even with being tied, it still took Ed and Gigi to hold Bear down. Even with being tied, it still took Ed and Gigi to hold Bear down. He looked up into Porky's face and spit. "You dirty, no good, fat, black son of a bitch," he said as Porky began to slowly shoot the dope into his vein. It happened instantly. Porky hadn't shot out all of the dope before Bear's head dropped. Porky cleaned the work slowly, watching Lenny out of the corner of his eye. He enjoyed listening to Lenny beg. Bear, there hadn't been any enjoyment. He had wanted to get it over with before anyone could see its fear. He stared at Lenny coldly, beginning to feel his penis rise. "If you was a little younger, Lenny, I might take the time out and stick something in you." Both of his gunmen looked at him curiously. Ed was used to Porky's freakishness, but this was a little too much. If it had been a woman, he could have understood it, but raping another man while not in prison was beyond his understanding. Porky drew the rest of the heroin up in a dropper. The terror he saw in Lenny's eyes was intoxicating. The mere thought of Lenny lying there completely at his mercy was better than any drug on the market. Porky felt his breath becoming harsh. "If it wasn't for this arm being fucked up, I would take the time to dally with you," he said, and bent down and felt for a vein. "Please, Porky, please, do anything you want, but don't kill me," Lenny screamed. He felt the needle slip into his arm, and he screamed louder. Porky pulled the needle out. "What motel is Teddy at?" he asked harshly. "You ain't got but one chance to save yourself, so you better be telling the real." Lenny was beyond any reasoning. He didn't stop to think. "He checked in the Blue Gardens on 7 Mile. It's just left of the freeway. Turn me loose, Porky. I'll take you out there." Porky's laugh was brutal. He leaned back over and probed for the vein. Lenny's scream was one of sheer horror as the needle sank in. It was over in less than a few seconds. "Take the bodies somewhere on the west side and drop them off. Then go get Teddy boy," Porky ordered. "He ain't even worth bringing back across town." He pulled the rest of the pure dope out. "This should be more than enough to finish it with. Bring what's left back." Both men started dragging the bodies towards the door. "Hey," Big Ed yelled, "we don't even know the room number." "God damn it." Porky walked up and down the room cursing. He stopped pacing. "I got it. Leave the dope here. You won't need it. Sometime tomorrow he's got to come out and check in again. So all you'll have to do is wait. When he peeps his funky head out the door, use them pistols." Both men nodded their heads in understanding. Gigi grinned. He had never shot a man before, and he looked forward to it. Porky watched them silently as they carried the bodies out of the room. Though neither man knew it, sometime in the near future, each one of them was going to have his own little overdose. It was a matter of simple survival, he thought coldly. 2 witnesses minus 2 would leave none. Teddy pulled back the blinds and glanced out cautiously. Again, he wished for the 1,000th time that he hadn't let Bear and Lenny know what motel he was checking into. At least he had enough sense to change rooms, he thought. He turned and glanced at the 4th of dope lying on a dresser. He wouldn't have to go out for a while at least. Maybe by then, everything would have quieted down. He stared at the dope, and a new idea popped into his head. Instead of checking into this same room, he just changed motels. That way, he reasoned, no one would have the slightest idea of his whereabouts. Someplace out on the highway. It would be nice if he had Terry with him. He could start all over with her. For a brief second, he allowed his mind to linger on the idea of picking her up, but he rejected it as being too dangerous. She lived too close to Porky. Now that his mind was made up, he started to move fast. He picked up the dope and put it in his pocket. He took a slow look around the room to make sure he wasn't leaving anything. He chuckled to himself. They had sure put it over on Porky. He could picture the fat man sitting around his apartment cursing about it. Damn, Eddie, one of us should at least go back across town and get enough stuff to last us. Ain't no sense in us sitting here looking out this goddamn window. And we're both sick. Big Ed walked over and glanced out. They had taken a room on the ground floor, right next to the alley. There was a passageway for cars to drive through. You could come in either the front way or from the alley. It was really a beautiful setup for what they had in mind. Their Cadillac was parked down the alley, near the exit. We ain't got the time, Ed stated. He gonna have to make a move pretty soon. It's damn near checkout time now. He removed his pistol and checked it again. Big Ed was fulfilling one of his wildest daydreams. He had always imagined himself as a professional hitman in his fantasies, and now they were coming true. Suddenly he tensed. "There's our little pigeon now," he said, his voice full of excitement. He stepped toward the door. His heart was pounding like a giant sledgehammer. Teddy closed the door behind him. It was a lovely day, he thought. Soon, spring would be here. It would be an end to all the cold weather he disliked so much. Suddenly, his blood seemed to freeze. From the corner of his eyes, he could see Big Ed and Gigi coming toward him. It couldn't be, his mind screamed loudly. How could they have found him this quick? Run! Something screamed inside him. Run! Before he could react, something slammed into him, spinning him around. Pain exploded in his back as he clawed at the wall for support. His strength seemed to flow from him as he sank slowly toward the ground. The rapid explosion of sound was lost on him as a blanket of nothingness enveloped him. Chapter 20. The shrubbery on both sides of the path leading to the immaculate buildings in the distance gave one a feeling of serenity and peace. Mr. Wilson held his wife's arm as they walked slowly up the pathway. The past few months had been a complete shock to both of them. Spring had come and gone. Now summer was in its brightest bloom, and there was still no change in Terry. It had all been a nightmare ever since that call late one night, informing them that their daughter was being held in a hospital. The hospital had turned out to be one for mental patients. The shock hadn't come until they had been able to see their daughter. Then it had become a nightmare. Even in their wildest thoughts, they had never imagined something like this ever happening to them. The desk nurse watched them as they came up the corridor. It was pitiful, she thought. Such a lovely young girl. Most of the nurses in the hospital talked about Terry. She was such a lovely thing. The nurse wished she had been gifted with such a shape and face. It wouldn't be going to waste in a nut house, she thought. They didn't even bother to stop at the desk. They knew the procedure too well. They got in the elevator and spoke politely to the operator. She gave them a hopeful smile as they got out on their floor. They stopped at the desk and spoke to the middle-aged, brown-skinned nurse. She smiled politely at them and got up. She led them down the hallway, and the room they stopped at was no different from the ones they had passed. They all had one thing in common. Each was doorless. There were 2 beds in the room, one of them vacant, the other occupied by a young girl who was looking out of the window. Her hair was neatly combed back, and when she turned and smiled at them, there was something childish about her that a person couldn't help but love. Her mother rushed to her and embraced her. "Oh, Terry, you're looking so lovely today," she said, as she crushed her to her bosom. The elderly man standing in the doorway blinked, trying desperately to hold back the tears that welled up in the corners of his eyes. The nurse noticed and glanced away. "I'll leave you now. Terry never gives us any trouble, so you'll be all right. The doctor said you could take her out for a walk if you want to," she added before she left. "Would you like that?" her mother asked, turning her daughter loose. "It's such a lovely day out." "Would you like that, Daddy?" Terry asked in a childlike voice. She jumped out of the bed and ran over to her father. Her every action was that of a child of 10 years old. Terry's mind had blanked out all the horrors of her brief adulthood. She had returned mentally to the time that had been most beautiful for her. There was no worry, no responsibilities, only the joy of living. Now, in her small world, she had only one fear, and the nurses tried to make sure she never came in contact with it. The sight of a needle would set her off, and for days she would live in a world of absolute terror, afraid to leave her room, plagued by nightmarish dreams. Her father took her arms and held them out, fighting back the tears, not wanting his daughter or wife to see him crying. Of course, child, that would be wonderful. Just you, me, and Mama walking in the sunlight. He fought it, but he just couldn't control himself. He pulled her to him. Oh, God, God, he cried. Why did it have to happen? Why? 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 She stared up into his face childishly. What's wrong, Daddy? What's wrong? Mama? What's wrong with Daddy? Mrs. Wilson went to the door and beckoned for the nurse. When she came into the room, she immediately saw what was wrong. She led Mr. Wilson from the room. He leaned against the wall and wept silently. His body shook from the dry sobs that escaped from his tightly clenched teeth. Finally, he managed to get himself under control. Thank you, he said quietly. I'll be all right now. You better be, the nurse said, pretending to be stern. You know that doesn't help our little girl in there, don't you? He nodded his head. I know. Sometimes it hurts to see her like that. If you could have only seen her before this happened. She used to be such a lovely young girl. The nurse agreed. Yes, it's easy to see that she was a beautiful young lady. Even in here, she's always so polite. Why, everyone on the floor just loves her. Now you march back in there and take her for a walk. And no more mess out of you. The rest of the afternoon was pleasantly spent walking around the grounds of the hospital. Sometimes they would wait patiently while Terry stopped and stared happily at the beautiful flowers that surrounded the paths leading to and from the main building. On the way back to the hospital, they stopped as Terry's doctor came down the steps of the building. He spoke politely to everyone, being overly kind toward Terry. She smiled at him. Hi, Dr. Parrish. Have you seen the pretty flowers yet? He was a youthful-looking doctor with blonde hair and sky-blue eyes. Yes, Terry, I've had the pleasure of seeing them earlier. He started to walk past, but Mr. Wilson stopped him. Could I walk along with you for a moment, doctor? He asked, deep concern showing in his eyes. Of course. Come along, he replied, and the two men walked off together as Terry and her mother continued up the stairs. We've been wondering, doctor. Terry's been here for over 3 months now, and we wonder if she will ever get well. Mr. Wilson continued, not wanting to be misunderstood. We realize you people are doing everything possible, but it's just that we don't fully understand what's the matter with her. Dr. Parrish hesitated. He had always found it difficult to explain what was wrong with his patients to their kin. Well, Mr. Wilson, he began, Terry was admitted to our clinic for observation after the state found her to be mentally incompetent. Now, since then, the staff here has gathered a clinical picture of Terry's problem, which is by no means complete. As of this date, we believe Terry is suffering from what is known as chronic frustration anxiety due to the traumatic experience of finding her friend dead. Through our conversations with Terry, she apparently feels she's at fault, which leaves her with a feeling of deep emotional guilt. She's not the cause of that other girl's death, her father stated flatly, then asked, is this the reason why she acts so childish? Isn't this unusual for a grown woman to act this way? It's only unusual in the sense that you don't see it every day, Mr. Wilson. But for the professional man like myself, there's nothing unusual about it at all. Terry had regressed to an earlier, more acceptable behavior in the belief that it will ultimately help her suppress an emotional experience that was too shocking for her mind to accept. Her flight from reality is nothing more than an escape, a relief valve for her mind. The doctor went on, trying to explain it in the most comprehensible way possible. My biggest problem is trying to get her to overcome this fear of hers for needles. When she stayed with us, she wasn't afraid of any needles, her father said. Why, she used to give her mother insulin shots. Yes, I remember your wife telling me this earlier when I talked to her. The doctor stopped. and lit a cigarette. Her fear is deeply rooted in her subconscious, her awareness of participating in causing the condition that she ultimately deplores. While she was using drugs, she had reached the stage of addiction. She attempted to maintain herself in equilibrium by taking adequate doses of heroin at set intervals, not disdaining the orgasmic kick associated with intravenous administration of the drug, but aiming mainly at the avoidance of withdrawal symptoms. The doctor caught himself. He was getting beyond the realm of what his listener could understand. "I'm sorry, Mr. Wilson. Sometimes I get carried away with myself." He stared at the older man. "Have faith, Mr. Wilson. I don't want to build your hopes up, but I do believe in my heart that one day you will see your daughter walk out of here just as she was before this terrible thing happened to her." Mr. Wilson stood on the pathway and watched the doctor walk away. Faith, yes, he would have faith and a little more. He would pray, and with the help of God, one day he would truly see his little girl walk away from here. He turned and walked back toward the hospital, his step firmer than it had been before. There was no more doubt in his heart now. It was just a matter of time. Chapter 21. The sun was a blazing ball of fire in the sky. Heat waves bounced off the pavement in a continuous pattern of heat. Porky wiped the sweat off his face and continued to gaze out the open window. "This is just about the hottest goddamn summer I've ever seen," he muttered, not really speaking to anyone in the room. His apartment was full of young addicts. Many of the older faces were gone, not to be seen again. Gigi had been buried for over a month now, an overdose, so all the addicts thought, to Porky's satisfaction. He didn't have but 2 doormen now, Big Ed and Dave, but they would do. Since the death of Bear and Lenny, plus Teddy, he didn't have any fear of being stuck up again. Suddenly, a convertible pulled up in front of his house and stopped. The driver jumped out of the car. Porky grinned. Young Ronald was coming back for the second time that day to cop. He stared at the 2 young girls still sitting in the car. From his window, they didn't look to be over 15 years old, but that was the way it was now. The new addicts were all young. That suited Porky just fine. He stared at the young girls, and when one of them looked up in his direction, he stuck his tongue out. She turned her head quickly, causing him to laugh. He grinned as Ronald knocked on the door. As soon as Ronald became strung out enough, the girls would follow. It would come to pass as sure as night turned into day, as he would be there to see it happen. It was a game of life that he played with all the junkies. Only the cards were stacked against the junkies, and he was the dealer. He stared around his house of horror at all the players. Tess was there with a new girlfriend, and Tess's girlfriend didn't look to be over 17. With all these young kids starting to use dope, this promised to be a beautiful year. Some of the dope fiends stared back at Porky insolently. He laughed loudly, brutally, in their faces. Some of them looked up from their nods and stared at him as though he was losing his mind. He leered at them knowingly. He knew he was holding the winning hand in the game. He didn't know of all of his faults. That was one he didn't have. Porky was not a dope fiend. This concludes this mini-series exclusively on Ralph Reads. I would like to take the moment right now to thank you, Queens and Kings, fellow royalty, for stopping by. You can connect with me via Twitter and Instagram as well as Periscope at rgmc2407. Drop me an email over to rgmc2407@gmail.com. If you would like to leave a small donation, you may do so at paypal.me/rgmc2407 or the Cash App. My cash tag is rgmc2407. You may also find me on my very own channel, RGMC Ralph Garcia, Master of Ceremonies, as well as right here at home on the United Ronin Networks. We are Ronin. Fellow royalty, pick up a good book, read a good story, and set your good self free. I appreciate you, and I love you like cooked food. I will see you folks on the next edition of Ralph Reads. Goodbye for now.